After 10 years of war, to gain control of Afghanistan, the Soviets finally gave up and left in 1989. When Kabul's communist regime crumbled 3 years later, the country found itself in a civil war between rebels from various ethnic groups: Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and Pashtuns. Afghanistan spiraled into total chaos. This ethnic civil war gave rise to a new movement, the Taliban. In Pashtun language, Taleb literally means a theology student. The Taliban are Islamic fundamentalists who study religion. Their supreme leader was Mullah Mohammed Omar, a hardcore fundamentalist who welcomed into his ranks terrorists from Saudi Arabia and Yemen, Al-Qaeda jihadists, and their leader, Osama bin Laden. In September 1996, the Taliban seized Kabul and most of the country, imposing a tyrannical Islamic regime and Sharia law. Only one man dared resist, a Tajik from the Panjshir Valley, Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was famous for having defeated the Red Army during the Soviet occupation. Isolated in these mountains, he led a northern alliance that struggled to resist the Taliban.
I was pretty good in school, and I went to the Saint-Cyr Military Academy. I spent 3 great years in France's finest school, receiving a military education, but also learning engineering, history, and geography, the things needed to understand the modern world. That's how I started my career as a military officer in the French army. But after several disappointments, I decided to resign in 1999 and became a free civilian again. I thought the fight in Afghanistan, with Massoud fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, was a noble cause. So I went to Afghanistan to join the adventure. I introduced myself to Massoud as a former French officer and told him about the time I had been on a diving mission where we planted mines under boats and sabotaged propellers. And he made a joke about how the Taliban didn't have any boats. And then I said something that finally caught his attention, which was that I was a certified French commando instructor. It turns out that Massoud had a team of commandos, a group that was a mix of both young and experienced people. He gathered them for me at a training camp and said, "You're a commando instructor. Here you go. Do your thing and teach them whatever you want. You have carte blanche." At that time, I think we had about 15,000 fighters on the various fronts. We were up against 10 times as many men, but we resisted. The Taliban were well equipped and had a lot of support from Pakistan, who wanted them to take over the country.
Armed by Pakistan and supported by Al-Qaeda fighters, the Taliban quickly gained control of 90% of Afghan territory. In the heart of their oppressive regime, a single French representative remained in office in Kabul, the chargé d'affaires, Jean-Yves Berthaud.
Je prends mes fonctions au sein de l'UNSMA.
I had a position with the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, or UNSMA, which was there to try to establish peace in a country that was being completely ripped apart back then.
En plein déchirement à l'époque, et j'ai continué mes activités afghanes.
I continued to do my job in Afghanistan, but I also became the chargé d'affaires, which roughly coincided with the Taliban, unfortunately taking control of the country.
En Afghanistan.
Nous sommes le dernier pays d'Europe.
We were the last European country to have an embassy in Kabul.
Et je me souviendrai toujours.
I will never forget one of the first diplomatic telegrams I received when I arrived at the ministry, which was the report from the newly appointed French chargé d'affaires, Jean-Yves Berthaud, in Kabul.
En m'approchant de l'entrée de la ville.
It said, "I arrived in Kabul this morning, and as I approached the city entrance, I noticed a garland hanging over the road. As I got closer, I saw the garland was made of hands." He went on to explain that punishment for theft was the loss of a hand, and all those severed hands were hung up on display by the regime's thugs.
Il faut se méfier
Many Westerners had a false understanding of diplomacy in the previous 20 to 30 years, thinking, through some sort of Western triumphalism, that we only talk to people who shared our values. And that's absurd. Diplomacy exists for exactly the opposite reason. It's designed as an alternative to war for addressing conflicts. It's based on being open to dialogue with anyone and everyone to understand their position. Then you adjust the level of talks, their symbolism, the image they convey. But once we understood the level of control the Taliban had in Afghanistan, there was no way we could get involved, even if we thought we should be helping Massoud, without being in contact with the Taliban.
The moment they arrived in Kabul in 1996, the Taliban publicly hanged ex-President Najibullah and his brother. It was an introduction to their barbaric interpretation of the Quran. While the religious students virtuously claim to be bringing back peace, this comes at a huge cost to the 17 million Afghans in the country. The mullah professes to be fighting vice with virtue and does so by imposing the most obscurantist and inhumane Islamic system on the planet.
My name is Malwi Kalmuddin, and I'm currently the leader of the Revolutionary Islamic Movement in Afghanistan. I was the Taliban's Minister for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. My goal was to heavily promote virtue until all vices disappeared naturally. We never wanted to directly or brutally intervene. That's why we trained people, young people. They went to the mosques in small groups to raise awareness and warn against all types of temptations. This was necessary to get uneducated people to follow Islamic precepts. We needed to teach them to abandon their vices and renounce everything that Islam prohibits.
The
Taliban delegation that we invited to Islamabad for peace negotiations stayed in a small guest house next to our offices. It so happened that the UN mission leader's secretary was staying in the same guest house. She came in the next morning looking very tired because the Taliban in the next room had been watching porn until 4 in the morning, and this poor lady had been unable to sleep. That helped us understand that at the end of the day, the Taliban were still human beings made of flesh and blood, and that their piety, despite what they claimed, was not above a certain number of temptations.
The Taliban are terrorists. They don't believe in peace. Their philosophy is to create eternal war. They view jihad as a religious principle, an Islamic obligation that forces the Taliban to fight constantly. Otherwise, they believe they'll be lost to sin. They believe that jihad guarantees them entry to heaven and that God will grant them mercy. The Taliban have absolutely nothing in common with the Afghan people or Afghan society.
Pakistan, backed by Western nations and an ally of the US, wanted to control Afghanistan. It was in Pakistan's Quranic schools that the Taliban were born and trained.
Pakistan was the Taliban's major supporter.
The
Pakistanis thought it would be good to have a regime that they controlled in Kabul. But they quickly realized they didn't really control it at all. Sometimes their puppets were out of control. And in our meetings with the Pakistanis, we asked them to rein in the Taliban, and they said it wasn't that easy, because of course they were uncontrollable.
Pakistan, the historic enemy of neighboring India, had always feared being trapped between two hostile countries. Trained in the US or the UK, the Pakistani officials and military leaders aimed at reigning supreme over the region. This meant that they needed to be heavily armed, which is how they became a preferred client of the US.
The Americans didn't really have a counterpart in Afghanistan. They knew they couldn't really recognize the Taliban regime, They couldn't be associated with it. So the American vision of Afghanistan was what was seen through Pakistani eyes. Pakistan was an ally of the United States and told them that the Taliban was simply part of traditional Afghan culture and that they needed to accept that fact. Massoud was simply a Panjshiri, a Tajik, a group that didn't mean much and that had never ruled Afghanistan. They weren't a proper solution to lead the country.
The Pakistanis didn't have a good relationship with Commander Massoud. They knew that Ahmad Shah Massoud would never recognize a Pakistani puppet government. The Pakistanis saw that as resistance and as direct opposition to them. It's true, because my brother would never have accepted a pro-Pakistan government in Kabul, and that's the real reason why the United States never helped him, regardless of what they claim.
That was the context in which Europe tried to make some progress by setting up a visit with European deputies from France and Belgium. I remember when the parliamentary representatives visited Panjshir.
In June 2000, a European parliamentary delegation traveled to Panjshir to meet Commander Massoud. Leading the charge was General Philippe Morillon, who had previously served as commander of UN forces in the former Yugoslavia and was a well-established peace advocate. The man who instigated the visit was a longtime friend of Commander Massoud's, Bertrand Gallet, who sought to raise political awareness about the Afghan conflict.
مسئله دو پاکستان دنبال یک عمق اسلامی است در پالو یک عمق جغرافیایی.
I think that I'm convinced that Pakistan's goal is a lot more religious in nature than it is geographical. Osama bin Laden, who's much talked about in Afghanistan these days, was trained by the Americans back in the day. They can't deny it. It's in that context that he took control of all the big madrasas, Pakistan's Quranic schools. The resistance is much bigger than that. It encompasses everyone who is Tajik, Pashtun, Hazara, and anyone else who understands the threat. They all oppose it. From this moment forward, all ethnicities need to unite against the foreign invasion. We're living in the 21st century, and globalization is bringing us closer together. No one could continue to exist in isolation without any contact from the outside. It's a natural phenomenon. With a tolerant and moderate Islam, our people can live in peace both internally and within the international community.
I wore a pakol like a local. I speak the language, and since I didn't use French in front of them, they thought I was Afghan, which suited me just fine. I attended a number of those meetings. Massoud wasn't a fool, he was sharp. What he needed above all else was military support. If an intellectual or a politician rallied behind him for their own personal interests, so be it. What mattered was that they showed up and brought back a vision that counteracted what many others in Paris were thinking.